Hey guys, this video is for my friends and family just to let you guys know what's going on with all the COVID stuff and why we're taking the measures we're taking in the United States. Feel free to share it if you want. Don't feel free to share it if you want. My name is Joshua Shu. I'm a board certified family physician. That by no way makes me an expert in infectious disease, but I'll tell you what I know. So pretty much what we're going to go over is what is the virus, what are the symptoms, what we know so far. Sorry, I have my notes here. And then why that is all important as far as what the measures we're taking. So if we talk about what the virus is, it's a coronavirus. We know it started in Wuhan in December. Wuhan's a province in China, I believe. We also know it's what they call a zoonotic virus or a zoonotic virus. I never know how to pronounce that. Basically, that means it gets transmitted from animals to the human population. Or the zoonotic is how it started. And we do know that this started probably at a large seafood market in Wuhan. For those of you unfamiliar, basically in China they have a lot of these markets, and they right next to the food they eat, they have other weird food they eat like bats. And they'll stack the cages on top of one another, and one animal will poop into the cage below it. That animal eats the poop, then we eat the animal, and voila, the virus is transmitted. So that's kind of what we're looking at. That's how this got started. So then they started recognizing that this was being transmitted to humans, and now we're at where we're at. So, okay. So if we're going to talk about the incubation period, the infectivity, the mode of transmission, and the life cycle of the virus, first of all, we need to know what the incubation period even means. An incubation period is when the time in which you contract the virus to the time in which you start displaying symptoms. On average, that's 2 to 14 days. The longest we have seen so far is 27 days. Now, it's hard to know if that's actually the case or if that's a case of double exposure, meaning, they tested someone who was they tested someone and they tested negative, and then 27 days later they got symptoms. Was that from their first exposure or perhaps a second exposure? We don't know. So we're just kind of going with 2 to 14 days. The average time someone, if you want a day limit, is 5.5 days or 5.2 days. So that's what you're looking at. As far as how it's transmitted, we do know that all things suggest that this is what they call droplet transmission. That means that it comes from mucosal, saliva, those kind of things. If you're sneezing, someone's in the same room with you, they breathe, voila, it's transmitted. With that, the CDC recommends to maintain your distance of 6 feet of people who we know are infected. The other thing is, someone wipes their nose, they shake your hand, then you wipe your nose. That's another way. We also know that contaminated surfaces, you can pick it up that way. Again, someone wipes their nose, they put their hand on a surface, and then the virus gets put on that surface, and another person touches the same surface, and then they wipe their nose, and then the virus gets transmitted. We do not know the hardiness of this virus yet, meaning we don't know how long it survives outside the body. As far as the infectivity period, we know that within 24 hours of infection of the virus, that's how long it takes. We also know that the viral shedding period happens for at least 20 days, which generally means that by the resolution of symptoms, we know that you're going to have probably about 5 days still of viral shedding. So from the period at which you contract it in 24 hours, you are contagious up until 20 days after. And that's just our best guess, right? Sometimes maybe that's 22 days, maybe sometimes that's 17 days, but we're just going with the averages here. So we went over all that. So what are the symptoms? It generally presents with flu-like symptoms. So the main ones that we're seeing and the most prevalent symptoms are, one, fever. Fever happens in about 98% of the cases by all the preliminary data. It's followed by a dry cough, and then it morphs into shortness of breath. That's generally after a week after you get the virus. So shortness of breath is generally at that point that's time to go to the hospital. Okay, in some patients, particularly the elderly, this can lead to a pneumonia, chest tightness, chest pain, and what they call ARDS. ARDS stands for acute respiratory distress syndrome. That means that, basically your lungs are scarring and we are having trouble getting oxygen into your body. That's most of the serious cases right now. So we define serious cases by people who need to be hospitalized. We define critical cases as patients who need to be on the ventilator. Long and short, the 80% of people who contract this virus are going to either be asymptomatic or their stuff is going to be very mild. Because we know that the people who are most at risk are the elderly, number one, and people who have risk factors. So you might be asking what the risk factors are. We know that the risk factors, we know that the virus you're at greater risk if you're over 60. If you have heart disease, if you have respiratory disease, COPD, asthma, chronic bronchitis, however you want to call it. But we do know, and then last but not least, diabetes. So those are all things that put you at an increased risk. Now, any chronic underlying health condition is also going to put you at risk as well. But unfortunately, we just don't know what the risk is for those because we don't have enough data yet. And the long and short of it is that we won't know those numbers until probably a year out. Let me see. The big caveat in this is not just an old person disease. Yes, those are the people who are at greatest risk. There are reports that we're hearing of people who are in their 40s and 30s who end up on a ventilator. We don't know why. We don't know if there are different subtypes of the virus yet. So we're just kind of hanging on and seeing where we're going. We're kind of, at best, let's be honest, we're flying by the seat of our pants here because we've never had to deal with anything like this. So, just hang tight. I mean, we'll do the best with the data that we have. And then, all right, we talked about that. Some of the important things that I've been asked, we do know that children are not as affected as much as really at all. And we do know that Betty White is okay. So kidding aside, that is a good thing that children are not affected, but that's also one of the reasons that we have closed all the schools. As far as mortality rate and why we're doing this, when you look at what the mortality rate is in South Korea versus what the mortality rate is in Italy, you'll see why the U.S. is taking the actions that they're taking. In South Korea, the mortality rate is below 1%. So what did they do there different from what Italy did? Because Italy is at about a 6 or 7% mortality rate now. They're the highest mortality rate outside of Wuhan, which is at 5.8%. So I keep saying the long and short, but Italy, there's reasons for that, right? Like Italy has one of the highest smoking populations in all of Europe. They also have one of the most elderly populations in all of Europe, and they do the thing where they kiss each other on the cheek. These are all suggestions of why maybe the mortality rate is higher. They have currently quarantined everyone to not all non-essential services, so grocery, banking, and medical. That's pretty much it, right? So that crushes the economy, but it saves lives in the long run. So even though the economics are bad, we do know that preventing those measures slows the spread of the virus, or starting those measures slows the spread of the virus. But they kind of did it a little bit too late, whereas, we don't actually know what the real mortality numbers are, right? Because if 80% of people are asymptomatic with this, we know that not everyone goes in and gets tested in the hospital. So the numbers that we have are not probably the real numbers. They're what they call a crude fatality index, meaning that, they're the numbers out of what we have tested. There's probably a whole bunch of people in Wuhan who have not been tested, and that would ultimately bring the mortality index down. I think South Korea and the Diamond Princess cruise ship are probably the most accurate things that you have as far as real mortality risk. So South Korea has tested more than anyone else. So we know that their actual mortality rate is probably closest to what it actually is. I think it's in the 0.7% right now. Don't quote me on that. And we know that the Diamond cruise ship is right around 1%. So, those things, because that was like kind of a quarantined area all at once. We know that X number of people, I think it was 696, were tested positive on the cruise ship, and we know that 7 have passed away. That was data as of yesterday morning. So if that's off, I apologize. So the question is, why are we doing this right now? Why are we having people social distancing? And the answer is not so much for you. If you're under 60, you don't have chronic underlying health conditions, that even if you were to contract this virus, the symptoms would not be probably bad. We don't know it well enough because we're unfamiliar. We've never had to deal with this. For the most part, what we're trying to do is limit you as a disease vector. That's why the schools have closed down. That's why the NCAA shut down. That's why the basketball season was shut down. By having big groups of crowded people who don't get sick, well, we already talked about it. The incubation period is 5 days. You don't have any symptoms, but you're contagious at that point. So basically, those act like an incubator, right, of disease, any sort of large crowds. No one gets sick. They all go out from there, and then they all go infect anyone who might be at risk. By doing this, by keeping people in their houses and limiting to essential services, what we are doing is trying to slow the spread so we don't get hit all at once at the hospital. We already know that the spread of the virus is imminent. Like the CDC predicts, by the end of March or early April, it's going to be widespread. What we're trying to do is slow that number down, right? Because if you think about it, let's say in the town that I practice in, there's 40,000 people by the 2010 census data. The hospital has 150 beds. On the 2010 census data, 14% of those people were over the age of 65. That's what, 6,000 or 7,000 people? If all 6,000 or 7,000 people get sick with this at once, and we have 150 beds, that's not even ventilators, we don't want to have to make the decision of who gets on the ventilator and who doesn't. And if you think they don't already have plans in place for that, you're kidding yourself. I just read a 270-page document, well, not all of it, but it was on vent allocations in a flu pandemic. So, the government, they want to I think in some sense they want to remove culpability from the physicians about who lives and who dies, right? We don't want to have to get put in that situation, or we want to avoid that situation as much as possible. So for you staying in your house, if you're a young person under the age of 60 without chronic underlying health conditions, well, yeah, this isn't for you. This is for other people. The economic issues are not for you. We understand that the economic issues are going to be huge. The government understands that. But you know what? This is a prevention measure to save lives in the long run, because we don't want the hospital systems all overtaxed at once. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. It's based on the infection of the virus, how long it goes without showing symptoms, and how many people we don't want at the hospital all at once. So even if 100 of those people need to be on the vent, right, out of the 6,000 people in my town, we still only have 150 beds at the hospital, and we have less ventilators than that. But if we get those 100 people over a span of 6 months, well, that brings down the mortality number, right? Because the better medical care people get, the better off we are. The last statistic I saw was there's 34 ventilators per 100,000 people. So if we know that the mortality rate is at 1%, and we know that there are 300-some million people in the United States, when we know that 3 million people, we're looking at a mortality rate. We can probably decrease that if we're spreading out the time at which those people get the virus. So that's what you're looking at. That's why it's important to stay in your house right now. I know it sucks, not going to the movies, not going out to eat, not doing the things that you need to do: grocery shopping, medical, stay at home. That's the best thing you can do right now for like your community. So if you guys have any questions, you can feel free to basically send me a message here on Facebook. If you guys need anything else, please let me know. And that's all I have.